Late in interviews, talking more feels responsible. It feels like you are protecting your candidacy. It feels like you're making sure nothing is misunderstood. It even feels like you're strengthening what you have already said. However, there is a stage in competitive interviews where talking more does not strengthen your position. It actually quietly increases risk. And that risk does not come from saying something incorrect. It actually comes from speaking beyond what was required. Let me show you what this looks like. Imagine you are in a late round interview for a senior role. The interviewer asks, "Tell me about a time you handled a difficult stakeholder." You respond clearly. You outline the context, describe the conflict, explain the resolution. You show judgment. Then the interviewer nods. They say, "That makes sense," and they move on to the next question. In that moment, many strong candidates feel unsettled. The answer felt strong. However, the response from the interviewer felt brief. So, when the next question begins, they circle back. "Actually, let me add something to that previous example." And then they expand. They introduce additional detail that was not needed. They introduce details about stakeholders' personality. They add nuance about internal politics. They clarify their emotional approach. None of it is wrong technically. In fact, it may even be insightful. However, the interviewer had already reached sufficiency. The example had landed. The capability had been demonstrated. By reopening it, the candidate has shifted the conversation from confirmation back into analysis. Now, the interviewer is listening differently. Instead of confirming strength, they're processing new variables. Was the conflict larger than initially described? Was the resolution more complicated? Is there instability here? Again, nothing dramatic has occurred. However, stability has been interrupted. This is the part most candidates miss. Late in interviews, the goal is not to maximize information. Rather, it is to preserve coherence. Earlier in the process, depth signals competence. Later in the process, depth can introduce variance, and variance creates cognitive work for the decision maker. Decision makers do not reward additional work. They reward clarity that feels settled. Let's stay with the example. Imagine the candidate had stopped after the initial structured response. There was clear situation, action, and result. The interviewer moves on, and that movement is not dismissal. Rather, it's progression. It often signals that nothing further is required. However, high performers are trained to optimize. They're uncomfortable leaving potential strength unused. So they add. And the addition reopens scrutiny. Talking more at the stage can unintentionally communicate, "I am not fully confident this landed," even when that is not the intention. Silence after clarity communicates something very different. It communicates judgment and calibration. It also signals that you know when the point is complete. That is a leadership trait. And late stage interviewers are listening for leadership traits, not storytelling range. Now, this does not mean you should be brief in general. It means you should recognize when sufficiency has already been reached. The most competitive candidates understand this distinction. They do not chase reinforcement once alignment is visible. They allow the answer to stand. They allow the decision to settle. And they resist the urge to improve what is already working. Because once interviews move into confirmation, additional strength does not increase probability. In reality, it introduces volatility, and volatility changes outcomes. If this feels subtle, that is intentional. Interview risk at this stage is subtle. It rarely looks like a mistake. Rather, it looks like enthusiasm, thoroughness, and engagement. However, disciplined restraint is often the stronger signal. If you have watched the first 2 episodes in this series, you already understand that interviews narrow quietly. You also understand that influence changes once evaluation begins to close. This episode builds on that foundation. If you haven't seen those, start there. Episode 1 explains how interviews narrow long before candidates recognize it. Episode 2 explains how influence shifts once evaluation is stabilizing. This layer only makes sense in that context. So, if you haven't, watch those next, then return to this idea. You will notice the moment when talking more feels helpful, and you will recognize when it quietly costs you.